Right, so everybody's freaking out about this cannabis study. The one linking weed to cancer and saying it messes with your DNA. Well, you wanted a deep dive. And I got my hands on the actual study. It's in addiction biology, plus some other related research. And let me tell you, things are not always what they seem.
It's wild, right? This study is like the perfect example of how a totally valid scientific finding can get blown way out of proportion.
Yeah, there's evidence that maybe cannabis use is linked to genotoxicity, meaning it could damage your cell's genetic information. But
Yep.
before you toss your CBD gummies, let's unpack what that really means.
Okay, so not exactly reefer madness part 2. Because I was about to build a bunker out of hemp seeds. Not quite. It's important to understand the nuances here. This study is drawing a connection between cannabis use, mitochondrial dysfunction, and ultimately chromosomal damage. Now, there's another study in Science that goes deeper into the mechanisms of this cellular damage. And here's the thing. That study wasn't even about cannabis. They're exploring how damaged mitochondria can lead to chromosomal breaks. It just so happens that cannabis use might contribute to that kind of mitochondrial dysfunction.
Hold on. Mitochondria, chromosomes, for those of us who haven't
Yeah.
opened a biology textbook in a while. Can you give us a little refresher?
Okay, think of your cells as tiny factories. Mitochondria are the powerhouses, providing the energy the cells need to run smoothly. Chromosomes, on the other hand, those are like the factory blueprints. They contain your DNA, the genetic instructions that make you you.
Got it. So cannabis use might mess with the power supply, which could then lead to messed up blueprints. And that's where the whole DNA damage and potential harm to future generations comes in, right?
Exactly. And that's the part that tends to grab headlines and send everybody into a panic. But here's where things get really interesting and where we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, you see? Cannabis isn't the only thing out there that can cause this kind of cellular and genetic damage. In fact, it might not even be the biggest offender.
Wait. There are other things that can mess with our DNA, and they're potentially worse than cannabis. Spill the tea.
You better believe it. We are bombarded by environmental factors every single day that are wreaking havoc on our cells, causing that same mitochondrial damage and DNA disruption that we're talking about. And these culprits, they often fly under the radar because they're not as exciting to study as something like cannabis.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Give me the rundown on these silent saboteurs. Who are the real villains in this story?
All right, get ready for a lineup of usual suspects. First up, we have those tiny terrors. Microplastics.
Microplastics. You mean those tiny bits of plastic we hear about polluting the oceans? What do those have to do with our DNA?
These little guys are sneaky. They're not just in the ocean anymore. They're in our air, our water, our food, even our blood. Recent studies have found microplastics in human blood, lungs, and even placentas, which means unborn babies are exposed to them before they're even born. And once they're inside our bodies, they can cause oxidative stress, which damages our cells and directly impacts our DNA.
So we're breathing and eating plastic bits
Yeah.
that are messing with our genetic code. That sounds
To say the least.
What else is on this cellular hit list?
Next up is another familiar foe, vehicle exhaust. Think about all those cars spewing out fumes every day. That exhaust is loaded with nasty stuff, like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, and heavy metals.
That doesn't sound good. But how do those end up affecting our DNA?
Well, PAHs and heavy metals have been shown to directly damage mitochondria, leading to those chromosomal breaks we talked about earlier. And if you live in or near a city, you're breathing in this toxic cocktail on a daily basis.
Suddenly, my morning commute feels a lot more apocalyptic. So, tiny particles, big damage. What's the next culprit on our list of silent but deadly villains?
Let's move on to construction and industrial dust. This refers to the fine particles released from building materials, demolition sites, factories, even things like mining operations. Some of the major offenders in this category are asbestos and silica.
Asbestos. Yikes. I know that's been linked to serious lung problems. And even cancer, right?
Exactly. And silica dust isn't much better. Long-term exposure to these types of dust can lead to severe lung damage, increasing the risk of things like silicosis and lung cancer.
So even if you don't work in construction or an industrial setting, you're still at risk from this stuff.
Think about it. Renovations, road work, even just the general air pollution in cities, all of these can expose you to varying levels of these harmful dust particles.
Okay, I'm starting to feel like I need a hazmat suit just to step outside. What else is lurking out there, ready to wreak havoc on our cells?
Well, for those of you with older homes, especially ones built before the 1980s, you might have insulation dust to worry about. Materials like fiberglass and even asbestos could be hiding in those walls and attics.
Asbestos again.
Yeah.
Talk about a renovation nightmare.
It's definitely something to be aware of if you're planning any home improvements. Asbestos is a known carcinogen, and it's been specifically linked to a nasty type of cancer called mesothelioma, even fiberglass. While not as dangerous as asbestos, can irritate your lungs and potentially cause damage over time.
All right. I'm adding check for asbestos to my to-do list. What's the final offender in this environmental lineup?
Let's wrap things up with a culprit that's a bit closer to home. Clothing and textile microfibers. You know those tiny fibers that shed from your clothes? Especially the ones made from synthetic fabrics.
Yeah, I'm always finding those little fuzzballs clinging to my clothes after doing laundry. Wait, are you saying those are bad for us too?
It's not the fuzz itself that's the problem, but what it's made of. Synthetic fibers like polyester, nylon, and acrylic are essentially forms of plastic. And just like those microplastics we discussed earlier, these tiny fibers can break down into even smaller particles that we inhale and ingest.
So every time I wash my clothes, I'm basically contributing to this invisible cloud of microplastic pollution that could be messing with my DNA.
That's the unfortunate reality. And it's not just laundry. Simply wearing these fabrics releases microfibers into the environment.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. Feels like microplastics are everywhere. The ocean, our food, our clothes. Is there no escape?
It can definitely feel overwhelming, but remember, knowledge is power. Now that you're aware of these hidden threats, you can start making more informed choices to minimize your exposure.
Okay, deep breaths. So we've got this cannabis study pointing to potential DNA damage, which sounds scary on its own. But then you've presented this whole other lineup of environmental factors that are causing similar damage, and arguably on a much larger scale. It's like worrying about a bee sting when you're about to walk into a hornet's nest.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights the need to put things into perspective. Yes, the cannabis study's findings are valid, but they need to be considered within a broader context.
Right. Let's talk context then. How does cannabis use really stack up against these environmental exposures?
Think about the scope of each. Cannabis use is largely a personal choice. You decide whether or not to partake. But these environmental exposures, they're often unavoidable. You can't just stop breathing air or drinking water. And for many people, avoiding things like vehicle exhaust or certain types of work environments just isn't feasible.
So in terms of sheer numbers, far more people are exposed to these environmental genotoxins on a daily basis than those who use cannabis.
Exactly. And the scale of that exposure is vastly greater as well. We're talking about constant cumulative exposure to these environmental factors versus what might be relatively infrequent or controlled cannabis use for some individuals.
That makes sense. What about the rate of damage? Is there a way to compare how much damage these different factors are causing at a cellular level?
It's difficult to quantify precisely, but we can make some educator inferences. While the cannabis study highlights a potential for DNA damage, its impact likely pales in comparison to the constant barrage from these environmental factors. It's like comparing a small cut to a swarm of mosquito bites. Both can be annoying and cause damage, but one is clearly a much bigger issue overall.
Okay. That paints a pretty vivid picture. So we're being realistic about the risks here. The environmental factors seem like the much bigger threat, at least in terms of their widespread impact. But how does this all translate to public health? What are the real-world implications of this constant exposure to environmental genotoxins?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? If we hyper-focus on the potential harms of cannabis, we risk creating an unnecessarily alarmist narrative. It's like shining a spotlight on a single weed in a field overgrown with them, you know? We might be missing the bigger picture, the more pervasive, systemic issues that are truly threatening public health.
I'm getting the feeling you're not exactly thrilled with how the media has been portraying this cannabis study.
Let's just say
Yeah.
that sometimes headlines don't tell the whole story. And when it comes to complex issues like DNA damage and its potential consequences, nuance is essential. Sensationalism doesn't help anyone.
It's interesting. We've been deep diving into the science here. But it feels like there's a deeper societal issue at play as well. This focus on individual choices, like cannabis use, while seemingly ignoring these larger environmental factors that are often beyond our control. It's like we're being told to worry about a speck of dust on our shoe when there's a mountain of trash looming in the distance.
You're absolutely right. It's almost as if we're being encouraged to blame ourselves for health problems that are in many ways a result of systemic issues, things that are often out of our individual control.
It's giving blame the victim vibes, for sure. And you know what? This whole conversation has me thinking, If we're finding microplastics in human placentas, that means unborn babies are being exposed to these genotoxic threats before they're even born.
Exactly, and that raises a whole other level of concern. If these environmental factors are capable of damaging DNA, in developing fetuses, what are the long-term consequences? Could we be seeing an increase in birth defects or developmental issues down the line?
And here's another thought. We've been talking about physical health, but what about mental health? Could these environmental exposures be impacting our brains as well?
It's a fascinating question, and one that researchers are beginning to explore more deeply. There's emerging research that suggests a link between environmental toxins, including those that damage mitochondria and DNA, and conditions like autism, ADHD, and even depression.
Hold on. Are you saying that pollution could be contributing to mental health issues? That adds a whole other layer to this crisis.
It's definitely an area that needs more research, but the early findings are concerning. We know that the brain is particularly vulnerable to damage from environmental toxins, especially during those critical periods of development.
So we could be facing a future generation, not only with increased risks of physical health problems, but also a generation struggling with mental health challenges, all because of the environmental mess we've created.
It's a sobering thought, and one that should motivate us to take action. We need to start demanding stricter regulations on pollution, investing in cleaner technologies, and frankly, just being more aware of the choices we make that contribute to this problem.
You know, it's ironic. I was initially drawn to this deep dive because I was curious about the cannabis study. And now, I'm honestly more worried about the microplastics in my tea bags and the exhaust fumes I inhale on my daily commute.
That's a perfectly rational response. And honestly, it's the kind of shift in perspective we need to see more of. Instead of getting caught up in the hype about a single study, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Let's start talking about the real elephants in the room, the environmental threats that are silently impacting our health and the health of future generations.
I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah.
So, where do we go from here? How do we fight back against these invisible enemies?
First and foremost, we need to arm ourselves with knowledge. The more we understand about these environmental threats, the better equipped we'll be to make informed choices. That means reading beyond the headlines, seeking out credible sources of information, and honestly, just being curious and asking questions.
Like you always say, knowledge is power, but knowledge without action is kind of pointless, right?
Absolutely. We need to turn that knowledge into action. That could mean supporting organizations fighting for stricter environmental regulations, advocating for cleaner energy solutions, or even making small changes in our own lives to reduce our environmental impact.
Like ditching those synthetic clothes and rocking that vintage cotton look.
Exactly. Every little bit helps. And remember, this isn't just about protecting ourselves. It's about protecting future generations. Do we want our grandchildren to inherit a world riddled with pollution and its associated health problems? Or do we want to leave them a legacy of a cleaner, healthier planet?
Powerful stuff. And you know, it's not just about big sweeping changes either, sometimes. The most impactful actions start with small individual choices, like choosing to walk or bike instead of driving, reducing our reliance on single-use plastics, or being more mindful of the products we buy and the companies we support.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about a collective shift in mindset, a recognition that we're all interconnected, and that our individual actions have ripple effects. If enough of us start making these conscious choices, we can create a powerful wave of change.
I love that image, a wave of change. Thinking back to that cannabis study, maybe it can actually serve a useful purpose after all. Perhaps it can be a wake-up call, a reminder that even seemingly small choices can have big consequences, and that we need to be more aware of the hidden dangers lurking in our environment.
I think you've nailed it. It's not about demonizing cannabis or any other single factor. It's about understanding the complexity of these issues, taking a holistic view of our health and well-being, and empowering ourselves to make informed choices that benefit both ourselves and the planet.
Well said. Well, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from cannabis and genotoxicity to microplastics and the hidden dangers lurking in our everyday environments.
It's been a fascinating exploration, and we hope it sparked some curiosity and critical thinking in you listening out there. Remember, knowledge is power, but it's only truly powerful when we put it into action.
So to you listening, we challenge you to take what you've learned today and make it your own. Do some research, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and most importantly, take action. Even small changes can make a difference. And together, we can create a healthier, more sustainable future for ourselves and generations to come.
Until next time. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged to